needs him? Hey, he wasn't there to teach me how to shoot my first basket, but I learned, didn't I? Hey, I got pretty damn good at it too, didn't I, Uncle Phil? Got through my first day without him, right? I learned how to drive.
Each of my siblings remembers that night in the bedroom. With me standing there in the doorway, I watched my father punch my mother so hard that she spit up blood. Daddy-O was one of the greatest blessings of my life, and also one of my greatest sources of pain.
What happened to Will Smith at 57 will shock you. He's been spotted partying with women half his age while his marriage crumbles publicly. The Oscar slap destroyed his $100 million empire, forcing him to take overseas gigs for a fraction of his former salary.
That was the only time in my life that I ever considered.
This is the real story behind Hollywood's most spectacular downfall. Will Smith learned to smile through tears before he could spell his own name. In the cramped row house on Winfield Street in West Philadelphia, 3-year-old Willard Carroll Smith Jr. discovered that making people laugh was the only way to stop the screaming. When his father's fist connected with his mother's face, Will would jump between them, cracking jokes and doing silly dances until the violence paused. His father, Willard Smith Sr., was a refrigeration engineer whose temper exploded without warning. The man who taught his son about hard work and discipline was the same man who terrorized their household with brutal beatings. Will's mother, Caroline, bore the worst of the abuse, her face often swollen and bruised, while she tried to maintain normalcy for her 4 children.
I watched my father punch my mother so hard that she spit up blood. Each of my siblings responded differently in ways that would go on to define who we were for much of our lives.
The most traumatic memory burned into Will's young mind was the night his father punched his mother so hard she collapsed unconscious on the kitchen floor. 7-year-old Will stood frozen, watching blood pool beneath her head, while his father walked away as if nothing had happened. That image would haunt him for decades, driving every desperate attempt to make people smile and avoid conflict. Will learned that his voice could be a weapon against violence. When tensions rose in the house, he would launch into rapid-fire comedy routines, impressions, and storytelling that distracted everyone from their anger. His siblings began relying on him to diffuse explosive situations. His mother would smile despite her pain when Will performed for her, and those moments of relief became his addiction.
I was less than 10 yards away, and I was the only chance she had for help, yet I did nothing. And I'm sorry, my mom. So sorry.
School became another stage where Will perfected his performer persona. Teachers and classmates loved his energy and humor, never suspecting the terror he lived with at home. He earned the nickname Prince for his smooth talking and natural charisma. But beneath the crown was a frightened child who believed his worth depended entirely on other people's approval.
I've been Prince for years and years. But about 2 years ago, the DJs in the street started scratching, fresh, this is fresh. Everything was fresh. So I added the Fresh Prince onto my name.
The neighborhood kids flocked to Will because he made everything fun, but he carefully controlled what they saw. No friends were allowed at his house. No one could witness the real Smith family dynamic. Will became a master of compartmentalizing his life, keeping the horror separate from the performance. His grades suffered because he spent more energy entertaining than studying, but his teachers passed him anyway because they enjoyed having him in class. Will learned early that charm could open doors that intelligence might not, a lesson that would shape his entire approach to success. By age 10, Will had perfected the art of reading rooms and adjusting his personality to match what people wanted to see. He was becoming a professional people pleaser, sacrificing his authentic self to maintain the peace and approval he desperately craved. The performer was consuming the person, and there would be no going back. When 16-year-old Will Smith met Jeff Towns at a house party in 1986, he found his escape route from the pain that consumed his daily existence. DJ Jazzy. Jeff needed a rapper for his sets, and Will's natural rhythm and clever wordplay made them an instant hit. Their first single brought them from Philadelphia block parties to nationwide recognition almost overnight.
There's no need to argue, parents just don't understand.
The success felt like more powerful than anything Will could have imagined. When crowds cheered for his performances, the childhood trauma temporarily disappeared. The boy who had spent years making people laugh to stop violence had discovered he could make thousands of people happy simultaneously. The bigger the audience, the more complete his amnesia became. Their breakthrough hit earned them the first ever Grammy Award for Best Rap Performance in 1989. Standing on that stage holding the golden gramophone, Will felt like he had finally proven his worth. The scared little boy from West West Philadelphia was now somebody important, somebody valuable, somebody who mattered to millions of strangers. But fame came with pressures that Will hadn't anticipated. Record executives wanted him to maintain a clean, family-friendly image that felt authentic to his personality, but also trapped him in a persona. He couldn't explore darker themes or express the rage and fear that still lived inside him. The performer had to stay happy, stay positive, stay perfect. The money from their music success allowed Will to move his family out of the dangerous neighborhood where he had grown up. But geographical distance couldn't heal psychological wounds. His parents' marriage remained volatile, and Will still felt responsible for fixing everyone's problems. Success had given him resources, but not peace of mind. When tax troubles hit in 1990, Will faced the possibility of losing everything he had built.
So they came to get their money, and I didn't have it, so they took everything. So really? It was that period in my life that Quincy found me.
The IRS demanded nearly $3 million in back taxes, threatening to destroy the career that had become his lifeline. The financial crisis triggered the same helplessness he had felt as a child watching his father's violence, unable to protect the people he loved. Quincy Jones offered Will a lifeline with television work that would make him a global superstar. But accepting the role meant leaving music behind and diving deeper into acting, another form of performance that would distance him further from his authentic self. The choice felt like survival rather than artistic expression. The show's success was overwhelming and intoxicating. Millions of people welcomed Will into their homes every week, laughing at his jokes and rooting for his character's success. The approval was constant and massive, feeding his addiction to external validation, while making it impossible to address the internal wounds that continued to fester beneath the surface.
Who needs him? Hey, he wasn't there to teach me how to shoot my first basket, but I learned, didn't I? Hey, I got pretty damn good at it too, didn't I, Uncle?
Will was becoming one of the most recognizable faces in America, but he still felt like that terrified child hiding behind smiles and jokes. Fame had amplified his performer persona while burying his real self deeper than ever before. The mask was becoming his face, and he wasn't sure there was anything genuine underneath it anymore. By the mid-1990s, Will Smith had achieved everything most people could dream of: television stardom, music success, and the transition to blockbuster movies. But behind the megawatt smile was a man drowning in the pressure to maintain an image of perfection that was slowly destroying his soul from the inside out. Hollywood executives loved Will because he was the safest possible choice for leading man roles. He was charming without being threatening, funny without being edgy, successful without being controversial. But this marketable persona required him to suppress every authentic emotion that didn't fit the brand. Anger, sadness, vulnerability, and complexity were off limits for the Will Smith character.
Daddy-o! What's up?
The pressure manifested in obsessive behavior around his career choices and public appearances. Will would rehearse conversations before interviews, anticipating every possible question and crafting responses that maintained his image. Spontaneity became dangerous because it might reveal something real, something that could damage the carefully constructed facade that everyone depended on. His first marriage ended in divorce partly because the relationship couldn't survive the demands of his career and the emotional distance his fame required. Will struggled to be genuinely present with anyone when so much of his energy went toward maintaining his public persona. Real intimacy meant vulnerability, and vulnerability threatened the performance that kept him alive. Meeting Jada Pinkett offered hope for authentic connection with someone who understood the entertainment industry's pressures.
I said, "Hey, Jada, what's up? It's Will." She said, "Hey, how you doing?" I said, "Good." I said, "Are you seeing anybody?"
Oh, my God.
And she said, no. I said, "Cool, you're seeing me now."
But their relationship began during Will's rise to movie stardom, meaning it was immediately subjected to intense public scrutiny and the demands of his image management. Even private moments became performance opportunities that required careful choreography. The success of major blockbusters cemented Will's status as a global superstar and box office guarantee. Studios would greenlight projects based on his involvement alone, giving him enormous power, but also enormous responsibility. Every movie had to succeed, every performance had to be perfect, every public appearance appearance had to reinforce his brand value. The weight of being Hollywood's most bankable star was crushing his spirit. Will felt like a human slot machine that everyone expected to keep paying out jackpots. The studios, the fans, the media, and his own team all depended on his ability to deliver consistent entertainment value. The pressure was constant and inescapable from every direction. Behind closed doors, Will began experiencing panic attacks and episodes of overwhelming anxiety. The same boy who had learned to perform under pressure was now a man whose entire livelihood depended on never showing cracks in his armor. But the armor was getting heavier every year, and his shoulders were beginning to buckle under the weight.
I would say don't just start filming me without asking me
Oh my goodness.
if you could film me.
Astaire, come help us again, please. I'm still dealing with foolishness.
Because she don't just...
His success had created a prison of expectations that felt impossible to escape. Will Smith, the brand, was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but Will Smith, the person, was suffocating under the weight of maintaining that brand. The performer who had saved him from childhood trauma was now threatening to destroy him as an adult. Will's marriage to Jada Pinkett Smith in 1997 was supposed to represent the perfect Hollywood power couple, but behind the red carpet appearances and magazine covers was a relationship struggling under the weight of public expectation and private pain. Both actors brought their own trauma and insecurities into a union that would be dissected by media and fans for decades. Jada had her own history of family dysfunction and struggles, making their connection feel authentic in ways that Will's previous relationships hadn't. But their shared understanding of pain also meant their problems amplified each other's unresolved issues. Two wounded people trying to heal together often create more damage than healing, especially under public scrutiny. The birth of Jaden and Willow brought immense joy, but also increased pressure to maintain their image as the ideal family. Will wanted to give his children everything he hadn't received, but his own emotional unavailability meant he often provided material comforts while remaining psychologically distant from their actual needs.
All my kids, y'all are my kids.
We're here.
Full facts.
Yes.
We're here at the table.
This is a red table takeover.
Their unconventional marriage philosophy, including periods of separation and open arrangements, became tabloid fodder that humiliated Will publicly. The man who had built his career on being universally likable found himself the subject of jokes and speculation about his personal life. His control over his image was slipping, and the loss of control triggered deep anxiety. The Red Table Talk episode, where Jada discussed her relationship with August Alsina, became one of the most painful public moments of Will's life. Sitting next to his wife as she described her connection with another man, Will's expression of devastation went viral, turning his private pain into internet memes and public ridicule that followed him everywhere.
And I feel like it's a situation that I considered private.
You just feel like it ain't really nobody's business.
but
But now Black Twitter has claimed it as their business.
The humiliation was devastating for someone whose entire identity was built on being admired and respected. Will had spent decades crafting an image of success and happiness, only to have his marriage problems exposed in the most public way possible. The mask was cracking, and millions of people were watching it happen in real time. His relationship with his children also suffered under the pressure of public scrutiny. When projects failed, his son reportedly asked to be legally emancipated, partly due to the harsh criticism surrounding their collaboration. The failure hurt professionally but devastated Will personally, making him question his value as both an entertainer and a father. The constant speculation about their marriage created additional stress that made genuine connection even more difficult. Every public appearance became a performance designed to prove their relationship was solid. Even their attempts at honesty felt like carefully managed crisis communications, rather than authentic sharing between people who loved each other. Will began to understand that his marriage had become another aspect of his brand rather than a source of personal fulfillment. The pressure to maintain appearances was destroying any possibility of real intimacy or healing. He was performing the role of husband and father while losing touch with what those relationships actually meant to him. The irony was crushing. The man who had learned to perform to save his family as a child was now performing so much that he was destroying his family as an adult. The coping mechanism that had once protected him had become the very thing threatening everything he claimed to value most in his life. By 2020, Will Smith was exhausting himself trying to maintain an image that no longer matched his internal reality. The release of his memoir marked an attempt at radical honesty, but even his confessions felt calculated and strategic rather than genuinely vulnerable. He was performing authenticity because he had forgotten how to actually be authentic without an audience.
I want the book to entertain, inspire, and
The book revealed shocking details about his childhood trauma, his thoughts, and his marriage problems. But the revelations served his brand rehabilitation more than his emotional healing. Will was still performing, just with different material that allowed him to appear vulnerable while maintaining control over the narrative and public perception. His mental health was deteriorating under the pressure of constant image management. The boy who had learned to read rooms and adjust his personality was now a man who had completely lost touch with his authentic self. He didn't know who Will Smith was without an audience to perform for or approval to chase. The pandemic forced Will into isolation that he wasn't equipped to handle. Without constant external validation through work and public appearances, he faced the emptiness that lived beneath his carefully constructed persona. The silence was deafening for someone who had spent 40 years avoiding genuine self-reflection through constant activity. His social media presence became increasingly erratic as he struggled to maintain connection with fans while dealing with his psychological crisis. The man who had mastered every form of entertainment was flailing in his attempts to seem relatable and genuine online. Even his vulnerability felt performative and hollow to audiences who could sense the desperation. The pressure to address his marriage problems publicly while maintaining his family's privacy created an impossible situation. Every statement about Jada felt like damage control rather than honest communication. He was trapped between his need for authenticity and his fear of losing the image that had defined his entire adult life and career.
In 2016, you and Will decided that you were going to live completely separate lives.
Yes.
It was not a divorce.
His relationship with his eldest son, Trey, from his first marriage, had been strained for years due to Will's emotional unavailability during his rise to superstardom. The guilt over prioritizing his career over his family relationships was eating away at him, but he didn't know how to repair damage that had been building for decades. The entertainment industry was changing around him, with younger stars and new platforms making his traditional approach to fame feel outdated. Will was no longer the safest choice for studios, and his box office guarantee was weakening. The foundation of his identity was crumbling, while his personal life remained in chaos. His attempts at spiritual healing and self-improvement felt genuine, but were complicated by his inability to separate authentic growth from image rehabilitation. Even his therapy and personal development work became content for his brand rather than private healing processes that could actually help him recover from his trauma. By 2021, Will Smith was a man on the edge of complete psychological collapse, held together only by decades of performance training and the fear of what would happen if he ever stopped smiling. The dam was about to break, and when it did, the flood would wash away everything he had spent his lifetime building. March 27, 2022, began as the culmination of Will Smith's lifetime dreams. Nominated for Best Actor for his portrayal of Richard Williams, he was finally being recognized by the Academy for serious dramatic work, rather than just blockbuster entertainment. But the night would end with one moment of uncontrolled rage, destroying everything he had spent decades building. Chris Rock's joke about Jada's bald head hit every trigger Will had accumulated over 40 years of suppressed trauma.
Jada, I love you. G.I. Jane 2, can't wait to see it, all right?
The public humiliation of his wife triggered memories of watching his mother being abused while feeling helpless to protect her. The laughter from the audience activated his deepest fear of being mocked rather than loved by the people whose approval he craved. In that moment, the performer who had spent his entire life avoiding conflict exploded with violence that shocked the world. Walking onto the stage and slapping Rock wasn't just about defending Jada. It was 40 years of repressed rage finally breaking through the carefully maintained facade. The real Will Smith was finally showing himself, and he was angry, hurt, and dangerous.
Oh, wow. Wow. Will Smith just smacked the...
The immediate aftermath was surreal as Will returned to his seat and screamed for Rock to keep his wife's name out of his mouth. The room fell silent, unsure how to process what they had witnessed. The man who had built his career on making people comfortable had made everyone deeply uncomfortable with his raw, unfiltered emotion. Winning the Oscar minutes later felt like a cruel joke. Standing on the stage with the award he had coveted for decades, Will attempted to explain his actions through tears, but his words only made the situation worse. He compared himself to Richard Williams protecting his family, but the analogy fell flat in a room full of people who had just watched him assault a comedian. The industry response was swift and merciless. Netflix canceled his upcoming projects, studios distanced themselves from him, and the Academy banned him from attending the ceremony for 10 years. The man who had been Hollywood's safest bet suddenly became its biggest liability overnight, toxic to every brand that had once courted his association. The public reaction was equally devastating. Social media exploded with criticism, memes, and endless analysis of his behavior. The same platforms where Will had tried to connect authentically with fans became venues for his public crucifixion. Every attempt at explanation or apology only seemed to make things worse and fuel more anger. His charitable foundation saw donations drop by 83% as corporate sponsors fled his association. The Will and Jada Smith Family Foundation, which had operated for nearly 30 years, was forced to begin shutting down. The slap had destroyed not just his career, but his ability to help others through his philanthropic work. The psychological impact was crushing for someone whose entire identity was built on being loved and admired. Will had spent his whole life trying to avoid conflict and make people happy, only to become one of the most hated figures in entertainment. The approval addiction that had driven his success was now torturing him with its complete absence. In the days following the incident, Will attempted damage control through public apologies and resignation from the Academy.
It's all fuzzy. I've reached out to Chris, and the message that came back is that he's not ready to talk.
But every statement felt calculated and hollow, reinforcing the perception that even his remorse was performative. The man who had mastered every aspect of public relations couldn't manage his way out of this crisis that kept growing worse. In the aftermath of the Oscar slap, Will Smith faced the first genuine crisis of his adult life that couldn't be solved through charm, performance, or image management. For the first time in decades, he was forced to confront the reality of who he had become without the distraction of constant work and public validation that had defined his existence. The isolation was brutal for someone who had spent 40 years addicted to external approval. Without movies to promote, interviews to give, or appearances to make, Will was alone with thoughts and feelings he had spent a lifetime avoiding. The silence forced him to confront the emptiness that lived beneath his carefully constructed persona. His attempts at public rehabilitation through social media and interviews only seemed to make things worse. Every apology felt scripted, every explanation seemed calculated, and every attempt at vulnerability appeared performative. The public had seen behind his mask during the slap and could no longer trust anything he presented as authentic or genuine.
That was a rage that had been bottled for a really long time. But at the end of the day, I lost it.
The financial impact was staggering for someone accustomed to earning tens of millions per film. Projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars were canceled or postponed indefinitely. His earning potential, which had seemed limitless just months earlier, suddenly evaporated as studios avoided the toxic association with his name and reputation. His family relationships, already strained by decades of emotional unavailability and public scrutiny, faced new pressures as they dealt with the fallout from his actions. Jada, Jaden, and Willow found themselves defending or explaining his behavior while managing their own careers and public images in an industry that now questioned their association with him. The mental health crisis that had been building for years finally reached its breaking point. Will began experiencing what he described as the darkest period of his life, grappling with depression, anxiety, and the complete collapse of his sense of self-worth. The performer who had always been on was finally completely off for the first time. His spiritual journey, which had begun years earlier, took on new urgency as he desperately searched for meaning and identity beyond fame and external validation. But even his attempts at healing were complicated by his inability to separate genuine growth from image rehabilitation strategies that might restore his career. The entertainment industry, which had once courted him aggressively, now treated him as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ego. and public meltdowns. Young actors were warned about the perils of believing their own hype, using Will's fall as an example of how quickly success could disappear. His legacy, which had seemed secure just months earlier, was now permanently tainted by those few seconds of violence. Decades of charitable work, entertainment excellence, and positive representation were overshadowed by one moment of uncontrolled rage. The man who had tried to be everything to everyone had become nothing to most people. The irony was devastating. Will Smith had finally shown his authentic self to the world, and the world had rejected him completely. The performance that had protected him for decades was gone, but what remained underneath wasn't strong enough to survive without the mask that had become his identity. Despite being one of Hollywood's most damaged figures, Will Smith shocked the world in 2024 by returning to what looked like a party lifestyle that seemed completely disconnected from his recent trauma and public downfall. Videos surfaced of him at exclusive clubs, dancing with young women, and appearing to live without consequences for his actions. The footage was jarring for audiences who had watched him cry through Oscar apologies and spiritual healing documentaries. Here was a man who had supposedly hit rock bottom, yet he appeared to be celebrating as if nothing had happened. The disconnect between his public remorse and private behavior felt like another performance, another lie in a lifetime of carefully crafted deceptions. But the partying wasn't celebration, it was medication. Will was self-medicating with the same that had saved him as a child, the approval and energy of crowds. Surrounded by people who still wanted to be near his fame, he could temporarily forget the crushing weight of public disgrace and professional exile that followed him everywhere else. The clubs and parties provided an environment where he could still perform the role of fun Will without the scrutiny of formal interviews or red carpet events. In dark venues with loud music and alcohol flowing, he could pretend to be the carefree entertainer he had once been, even if only for a few hours at a time. His dance moves, once charming and spontaneous, now looked desperate and manic. The 56-year-old man, gyrating with people decades younger, appeared to be having a midlife crisis in real time, but the dancing was actually a form of dissociation, a way to escape his body and mind through repetitive movement and music that drowned out his thoughts. The women surrounding him in these venues weren't necessarily romantic interests, but validation suppliers. After spending months being criticized and rejected by the public, being desired by attractive young women provided temporary relief from the crushing blow to his ego. He was seeking proof that he still had value, even if that value was purely superficial. Social media posts from these outings showed Will looking artificially happy, his smile too wide, and his energy too forced. The contrast with his recent confessions about depression and thoughts was stark and unsettling. He was performing happiness while dying inside, just as he had learned to do as a traumatized child.
That was the only time in my life that I ever considered.
The partying also served as a form of rebellion against the image rehabilitation his team was trying to orchestrate. After decades of careful brand management, Will was acting out like a teenager who had finally escaped parental control. If he couldn't be the perfect star anymore, he would be the cautionary tale instead. His behavior during this period reflected classic trauma responses: risk-taking, self-destructive choices, and desperate attempts to feel something other than pain. The man who had spent his career avoiding controversy was now courting it, as if negative attention was better than no attention at all from a world that had rejected him. But even his wildest nights couldn't silence the voice in his head that told him he was worthless, unlovable, and fundamentally broken. The parties ended, the music stopped, and Will was still alone with the same demons that had tormented him since childhood, now amplified by the fresh trauma of his public destruction. At 57, Will Smith had become a living ghost haunting his own legend. The man who once commanded $20 million per movie was now booking international projects where his American disgrace carried less weight. He traveled to remote locations where paparazzi couldn't follow, and audiences didn't know about the slap that had defined his recent existence. His foreign work felt like exile disguised as opportunity. Studios in Asia and Europe were willing to hire him at a fraction of his former rate, treating him like a has-been rather than a superstar. The roles were smaller, the budgets were lower, and the respect was non-existent. But work was work, and performing was still his only escape from reality.
I never asked for this mantle.
The money couldn't fill the void that had been growing inside him for decades. Despite earning hundreds of millions throughout his career, Will felt poorer than he had as a child in West Philadelphia. Material wealth had never addressed the fundamental emptiness that drove his need for constant validation and approval from strangers. His relationship with his children had become strained as they watched their father's public humiliation and private breakdown. Jaden and Willow were building their own careers while managing the stigma of their family name. They loved their father, but couldn't save him from himself, just as he had been unable to save his mother from his father's violence. The spiritual seeking that had begun as genuine exploration was now desperate grasping for anything that might provide meaning or relief. Will cycled through different philosophies, therapies, and healing modalities like a man drowning and grabbing at anything that might keep him afloat.
That plucks a childhood space
Yeah.
of inadequacy, and when someone comes at me like that, the little boy is fully in that space.
But enlightenment couldn't be performed, and his approach remained fundamentally transactional. His marriage to Jada had effectively ended years earlier, though they maintained public appearances and shared family responsibilities. Both had moved on emotionally while remaining legally connected, creating a strange limbo where they were neither together nor apart. The relationship had become another performance for their children and the public. Sleep became elusive as Will's mind raced with regrets, fears, and scenarios where he might reclaim his lost status. He would lie awake replaying the Oscar night, wondering what would have happened if he had just laughed at the joke or walked out instead of destroying everything he had worked for in a moment of uncontrolled rage. The thoughts that had plagued him for years intensified during this period. Success hadn't cured his depression, it had only provided better distractions. Now that the distractions were gone, Will faced the full weight of his psychological pain without the buffer of fame and adoration that had previously masked his suffering. His few remaining friends walked on eggshells around him, unsure how to help someone whose problems couldn't be solved with career advice or financial assistance. Will needed fundamental healing that went beyond anything Hollywood could provide, but he remained trapped in patterns that had been established in childhood and reinforced by decades of performance. The man who had spent his life making others happy had become incapable of experiencing genuine joy himself. Every smile was forced, every laugh was hollow, and every moment of apparent happiness was immediately followed by the crushing return of reality that reminded him how far he had fallen from grace. At 57, Will Smith continues his desperate dance through the wreckage of his former life, still seeking the approval that has always remained just out of reach. The clubs and parties provide temporary relief, but each morning brings the same emptiness that has haunted him since childhood. He wakes up in expensive hotels feeling poorer than he ever did, growing up in West Philadelphia. His new music releases attempt to process his trauma through art, but even his pain has become a performance designed to rehabilitate his image rather than heal his soul. The songs about struggle and redemption feel calculated rather than cathartic. Another strategy in his endless campaign to win back public favor that may never return to him. The international film projects continue, taking him to countries where his disgrace carries less weight, but also where his talent matters less. He performs for smaller audiences and lower stakes, a former king reduced to entertaining in the provinces, while his kingdom remains forever lost to him through his own actions. His children have grown into young adults who love their father, but recognize his fundamental brokenness. They watch him cycle through the same patterns that destroyed his career and marriage, unable to break free from the performance addiction that has consumed his authentic self since he was a child, learning to dance for his parents' approval. The spiritual seeking has become another form of shopping, consuming different philosophies and practices without allowing any of them to fundamentally change his approach to life. Will remains a tourist in his own healing journey, never staying in one place long enough for real transformation to take root in his damaged psyche. His wealth provides comfort but not peace, isolation but not solitude, options but not direction. The mansion where he once contemplated remains a monument to his success and his suffering, filled with awards that mean nothing and empty rooms that echo with the ghosts of his former happiness. The approval addiction that saved him from his father's violence continues to torture him in its absence. Will Smith, the performer, exists for audiences, but without their love and validation, he struggles to exist at all. The character has consumed the man so completely that there may be nothing left to recover underneath the decades of carefully crafted personas. His story continues not because it has found resolution, but because the performance never ends. At 57, Will Smith remains trapped in the same patterns that began when he was 3 years old, making jokes to stop his father from hitting his mother. The stages have gotten bigger and the audience is larger, but the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. The tragedy isn't that Will Smith fell from grace, it's that he was never truly himself long enough to fall from anything real. The person the world loved was always a character, and now that the character has been rejected, there may be no one left underneath to rebuild from. The boy who learned to perform to survive became a man who cannot survive without performing. The dance continues in nightclubs and foreign film sets, on social media, and in therapy sessions. But it's the same desperate movement that began in a violent household decades ago. Will Smith keeps dancing because standing still means facing the silence where his authentic self should be, and that silence has become more terrifying than any audience he has ever faced in his long and troubled career. Anyway, that's it for the video, folks. Bye.